tonight for what's sure to be an exciting, informative, and inspirational evening. Our guest tonight has certainly accomplished her share of inspirational feats. Feats of physical strength, feats of mental fortitude, and absolutely feats of endurance. She holds the current fastest known time on the Appalachian Trail, a 2,181-mile wilderness trail that spans from Maine to Georgia. She did it in 46 days, 11 hours, and 20 minutes. Most of us, I suspect, believe it to be a feat of endurance to drive the 20 hours on the freeway, especially if you have young children traveling with you. Imagine hiking alone, averaging 47 miles a day. Dealing with the elements might be bad enough. But as we'll hear tonight, dealing with your emotions, fighting fatigue, and staying focused, or rather, pretending to be someplace, anyplace else, is the real feat of endurance. She was National Geographic's choice in 2012 for Adventurer of the Year, has been featured on NPR, CBS Early Show, ESPN, has shown up in publications like The Washington Post, Backpacker, Runner's World, and more. She's written 6 books. Her latest, titled The Pursuit of Endurance, Harnessing the Record-Breaking Power of Strength and Resilience, will be for sale after the presentation, and she's graciously said she'll stay to sign your copies. We're so happy that she's here tonight, willing to share her adventures and lessons learned along the way. Will you please help me give a warm welcome to our special guest tonight, Jennifer Pharr Davis.
Hey, y'all. Thanks for coming out tonight. I am really excited to be here. My husband and I and our 2 young children have been traveling around the country for the past almost 4 months now. And out of all the places we've been to so far, Michigan has been our favorite state. But shh, don't tell. Colorado gets very upset when you choose another state. But we've been here for almost a week now. We came through the UP and we've come down, and Midland just seems like the sweetest town. We ran today, we saw all the marigolds, and we really love it here. So it's a joy to share my love of the trail with you. And as you heard in the introduction, I do love trails. I love to hike, I love to run, I love to picnic with my kids. Anytime I'm outdoors and on a trail, I'm pretty happy. And I've been fortunate enough to hike in all 50 states. I've hiked on 6 different continents, over 14,000 miles. But my favorite trail is the Appalachian Trail. And I am curious here in Midland, Michigan, how many of y'all have been on the Appalachian Trail? That's pretty good. Some people are like late hand raisers. Oh, I've done that. Has anyone in here completed the trail? I'm curious about that too. That's awesome. When did you do that?
I started in 2006 and I finished 3 years ago.
3 years ago. Congratulations. So the Appalachian Trail, if you haven't been on it, it's 2,190 miles long. It goes through 14 separate states between Georgia and Maine. And I've been fortunate enough to complete the entire trail 3 separate times. Yeah. And it was the most recent time, which really isn't that recent anymore, but in 2011, and before having children, I went out with my husband's help and set the overall record on the trail, completing it in 46 days and averaging 47 miles a day. And that's crazy, right? Well, thanks. See, I love Michigan. You guys are so nice. But I have sort of learned on this book tour that you can't just start with crazy. You have to build your credibility first. So I briefly need to let you know how I found trails and why I wanted to set a record. And the truth is, I did not grow up as a child hiking or backpacking or camping. And on one hand, that makes me really sad because I think it's one of the best and healthiest things you can do as a family. Personally, I know for me as a mom, it checks off the 2 most important boxes, and that is it's free right? And it wears them out. So trails and libraries, that's really where we spend our time. No, thank you. But the good news, the very good news, is that it's never too late to find trails. And they meet you at every phase of life. And I met a really wonderful example of that this spring. I was actually backpacking on a trail in Alabama, and I met a fellow. And when you hike these long trails, it's pretty common that people take nicknames or trail names out there. So I met a man who's 79 years old, and his trail name is Nimble Will Nomad. And he's way far eclipsed my mileage. Isn't it nice to be inside telling trail stories tonight? Much better than hiking through a thunderstorm. So anyways, Nimble Will Nomad has hiked over 40,000 miles of trails. And the kicker is, he didn't get started until after he turned 60. Wow. Talk about an active retirement, right? That guy is my hero. Yeah. So it's never too late. But for me personally, I found trails when I was 21 years old. And at that point, I had graduated from college, and I had this wonderful liberal arts degree and absolutely no clue what it was I was going to do with my life. So I wanted time and a place to figure things out, and I also, frankly, wanted to just go outside. It really struck me that my life and my education had taken place, for the most part, indoors. And I knew very little about nature, and I wanted that to change. So growing up in North Carolina, I'd always heard of the Appalachian Trail, and I had never set foot on it before, but I went home, gathered my brother's old Boy Scout gear, and then set off on my own from Georgia with the goal to hike the entire trail. And if you're trying to hike the whole thing and you're doing it at once, but you're not trying to set a record, how long do you think it'll take you?
5 months.
5 months. Good guess. Yeah. It could take 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 months, but most people out there will take 5 or 6 months. And on my initial journey, I was out there for 5 full months. And when I got to the end, I was a very different person. And because of the trail, I valued simplicity. And I learned I could be content and happy with just the items I carried in a pack on my back. And that sounds Spartan, but it was incredibly liberating. Because when you realize you don't need stuff or things to be happy, it allows you to invest in experiences and adventures. And I learned a lot from the people I met on the trail. And that surprised me because I knew I would learn from nature and there was a lot of self-discovery, but I actually underestimated the community. And that's actually, I'll say, the criticism or the knock on the Appalachian Trail is that when you compare it to other long trails, people will say it's crowded or it has too many people on it. And I didn't find that to be true. But there are lots of folks that you'll meet, and the way I spin it, what I like to say is that it's the most community-centric trail that I've ever hiked. And I loved knowing that every day I would meet new and interesting people. And it's all sorts of folks. You have day hikers, families, people out for the weekend, people section hiking it, so doing it over years, over decades. You have the thru hikers trying to do it all at once, and one way is not better than another. But I will say, out of the thru hikers, the folks trying to do it all at once, last year, over 5,000 folks started hoping to hike the entire trail. But how many do you think finished?
376.
I like the precision. It's a little off. We could say probably, and I don't know the exact number actually, but it was just north of 1,000. And typically it's about 25%. So 1 out of 4 people who start will finish. But the part I love is that you can't be sure about who will finish. Do you guys want to guess the youngest person to complete the trail? 5. You guys are really good guessers in Midland. So I will say this, it was right. 5 was right. If I had said, who is the youngest person to hike the entire trail, you would be correct. Until last year, the answer was that three separate 5-year-olds had hiked the entire trail with their families. Yeah, it's crazy. I have a 5-year-old, okay? And it takes us about 2 hours to go 1 mile, and it requires strategic M&Ms dropped about every 200 feet on the trail. But then last year there was a mom and a dad who started with their 1-year-old. And one of them would carry their daughter and the other would carry the gear. But they made it the whole way. The whole way. Yeah. What? Katahdin, they did it all. They did it all. They went through the White Mountains. It took them longer. It took them 8 months, but they completed it. And that also, the terrain up there, there's a lot of scrambling, very difficult. And for me, what I think of as being especially difficult, because I also have a 1-year-old, the diapers, right? The diapers, carrying all those diapers. So I'm not only very impressed, but I'm kind of like, well, good for them, not for me, you know? But on the other hand, and equally as impressive, there was an 82-year-old who finished last year. There have been multiple legally blind hikers to complete it with their seeing eye dogs, and a few years ago there was a woman with a prosthetic leg who hiked the whole thing. So you never know who you're going to meet, and you can't be sure who will finish. And I also want to point out, just because it was so important to me as a 21-year-old, I will say the 2 main groups out there trying to do the whole trail are typically folks just out of school and individuals who have recently retired. 2 good times in life to take a 5-month hike. Also a really amazing combination, because there is such an exchange of energy and wisdom. And I spent so many miles hiking with folks in their 60s and 70s, and they had a lifetime's worth of experience, and on the trail they had time to share their stories. And I'm going to tell you, on multiple occasions, one of them would turn to me and share either what they were most proud of in life or their biggest regret. And every time that happened, I thought, this is an education. This is more valuable than anything I learned in school. So I love the community, and I also surprisingly realized I love spending time alone. And that was a surprise to me, because when I started, I was terrified to spend time alone. At first, I was worried about my safety, because quite frankly, everyone else was worried about my safety. My mother and relatives and friends and older brothers. But once I got used to the reality of the trail, I really didn't feel scared about my well-being, but I continued to be worried for a long time that I was going out on this 5-month hike and that I was going to struggle with feeling bored and lonely. And I still remember the first day I felt bored on the Appalachian Trail. And there was no one around, and I could hike, but I didn't have to hike. And I think it was the first time in my life where I didn't have to react or respond. And I almost felt lost in that freedom. It was awkward at first. And then the more I got used to it, the more I got used to not having to think, to not constantly being stimulated, to not feeling forced to respond with social cues, the more I realized it was awesome. And spending time alone is when I started to get to know who I was on the trail. I learned what made me cry with no one else around. A lot less. I don't cry near as much if there's no hope for sympathy. On the trail, I just figured it'd dehydrate me, so I didn't cry nearly as much. I found that I still laughed a lot. I laughed without anyone else around. And it really struck me by the end that as much as I valued that community, I felt like you can't really be your best self in community unless you can also be comfortable being alone. And I just love that the outdoors gives you both options. But the thing I missed, so we'll get to this. So I finished the trail and I got off and I got a job, and that made my mom incredibly happy. And the thing I missed the most about hiking was how beautiful I felt on the trail. And that absolutely does not make sense, because when I was on the trail, I was filthy, right? I can also say, out of all the trails I've hiked all over the world, you smell the worst on the Appalachian Trail. Something about the heat and humidity, but it's pretty bad. And I was also covered, in scrapes and bug bites and bruises. But for 5 months, I didn't carry a mirror. And I know this dates me, but it was before the age of the selfie. I wasn't taking digital pictures of myself. I actually carried those wind-up disposable cameras. You remember those? I actually saw one in the grocery store today, and I was like, yes, I'm not that old, So yeah, no selfies. And then I also didn't have billboards or magazines or commercials telling me what I should look like. So I was forced to see myself differently, and I started to see myself through my interactions with other hikers. And if I was kind, and if I could make someone else smile, that was my reflection. That made me feel pretty. And then growing up, I had always thought that nature was beautiful, but usually it was looking out a window. And I had never seen myself as a part of nature, and I had never seen myself as a part of all that beauty until I hiked. And then after going over 2,000 miles and hiking through 14 states, all of a sudden, I based my self-worth a whole lot less on how I looked and a whole lot more on what I could do. And the Appalachian Trail made me realize that I could do so much more than I once thought was possible. So now I wanted to do more. And what is one thing that you think I wanted to do more of? Any guesses? Yeah, hike. That's it. That's another thing I love about trails is you find one and it leads to another and it leads to another, and pretty soon you realize there are trails everywhere, all over the US, all over the world. Most of them are free to access. So in my opinion, hiking is the most affordable, universal, and best way to travel. And I will say that sometimes my husband disagrees with me. We celebrated in June, we had our 10-year wedding anniversary. But since we've been on the road for 4 months, we really didn't celebrate. We have not had a babysitter, in fact, in almost 4 months. But we're hoping that we can do something special this fall to celebrate. And the one thing my husband has asked is that, can we please not hike? So we'll see. Jury's still out. But I did want to share with you guys some of my favorite hiking pictures from different trails all around the world. So we'll watch a short slideshow, and as the photos scroll through, I'll try to tell you where they were taken. So we'll start the journey in Africa at Mount Kilimanjaro.
Rise and fall like the tide. My hand moves with your chest. Steady now, moon will pull a slow and even
This is in Australia.
Out of the blue, the storm rolls in. I see
So this is Australia.
eyes. Thunder strikes, but I will be a place for you to hide.
And this is South America. This is in the Andes. That hurt. is on the Inca Trail to Machu Picchu.
Let my voice anchor you. I promise the sun will rise. Your heart rises and it falls just like
This is the Pacific Crest Trail.
it's just before it breaks. I will light a candle for your welcoming. Baby, come home to me. I'm standing on the shore. I am holding a light. I am standing on the shore. I am holding a light. I am standing on the shore. I am holding a light. I am standing on the shore. I am holding a light. Your heart rises and it falls.
All the rest of the pictures are from Europe.
Just before it breaks, I will light a candle. Your heart rises and it falls just like a wave's the highest point. It's just before it breaks. I will light a candle for your welcoming. Baby, come home to me. Your heart rises and it falls just like a wave's the highest point. It's just before it breaks. I will light a candle for your welcoming. Baby, come home to me. Baby, come home to me. Baby, come home to me.
Okay, so hopefully you guys enjoyed the photos and you can see or you know that the trail can take you to really incredible places. And I'm gonna keep going. I'm gonna dive into that record stuff. But before I do, I just wanna pause for a quick moment because we've covered a lot of ground. We've hiked the AT once, been around the world. Are there any questions before I keep going? Does everything make sense? Is there anything you need to know? Yeah.
Your initial fear of crime on the Appalachian Trail.
Mhm.
What statistics are there about the assumptions from people there?
Yeah, so the question was about crime on the Appalachian Trail and the statistics surrounding that. I think most of the fear is caught up in things that are not based on statistics, but are simply countercultural. It's not common now that people spend significant time alone or in places where there's not immediate access or communication opportunity, so that feels very scary. But statistics on the trail actually show that the time you're in the most danger on any hike is actually driving to the trailhead. Driving. And that's, we get in our cars every day and we know we could have an accident, but we don't think twice about it because everyone does it. And then they've also done comparisons where they take the population of the trail, they take either all the through hikers or they take all the users, the day hikers, the section hikers, and then they compare the crime to towns of similar sizes. And every single time the towns have a higher crime and incident rate than the trail. And the other thing I'll point out is that when I started, I was terrified of bears and snakes. Seen plenty of bears, plenty of snakes. I've never had a negative encounter. The two animals I've had the worst experiences with on trail have been unfriendly dogs off leash, and then insects like stinging wasps or bees or ticks. I actually think your greatest risk right now for hiking the Appalachian Trail is probably Lyme disease from deer ticks. So it's not what you would think when it comes to safety. I think the greatest risks are often underestimated on the trail. But I'm not saying that there's not risk. There are. But I think the advantage or the benefit is worth the risk. Mountain lions are theoretically extinct on the East Coast, except that several of my friends have seen them. Yeah, I have seen one mountain lion. And just like the other larger animals, the bears, black bears, grizzlies, snakes, usually the wild animals just want to get far away from you. Or they're so into eating their berries or whatever they're doing that they really don't care that you're there. The one exception I had to that is when I was hiking in Australia. First of all, I realized that kangaroos are not as cute and cuddly as the children's books make them seem. And then they also had emus, so 5-foot-tall birds. And I rounded this turn one time, and there was an emu about 30 yards down the path. And again, my expectation now is if I see a wild animal, usually it stands its ground or it runs away. This emu took one look at me and started running right at me. And so I had picked up this bamboo stick as a hiking pole, and I instinctually I got down in this kung fu position, and I thought to myself, this is it. Like, this is how it ends. It's me and the emu to the death in Australia. But then when it got within 10 yards, it actually veered off into the forest. And wild animals, I had heard of something called a false charge. I had never seen it until then, but there will be on occasion animals who will lunge or even run at you to try to scare you off their turf. So that's what happened. That's been my scariest wild animal encounter on the trail. One other question, yeah?
So when you were doing your record one, did you have people like supplying you, or did you have to go into towns, or how did you manage your supplies?
Okay, great segue. So all the photos and the hike that we've talked about up until this point, it's all been traditional backpacking. So typically I carry several days worth of food, and then I get to a road, or sometimes the trail even comes to a small town where I can reprovision. And occasionally there's a grocery store. More often what hikers will do is actually prepare a box of food and ship it ahead to a post office or a campground or hostel. And they'll pick it up, and if they've planned correctly, they'll have another 3 or 4 days worth of food and maybe fresh socks and anything else they might need. So they take all that and then keep going until the next resupply point. So that's most of my miles. But then, and what I last mentioned is that hiking the Appalachian Trail made me want to do more. But it wasn't just more hiking, it made me want to do more with my life off trail. And one of the biggest things is that when I was 24, I quit the only real job I've ever had. I was working at a museum, and I started my own hiking company. Because the trail had been so powerful in my life and so transformative. And at that point, I just had friends and contacts and acquaintances asking if I could help them get outside. And that's what I wanted to do. So I started Blue Ridge Hiking Company in Asheville, North Carolina, and we're over 10 years old now. And we get over 1,000 people a year out on the trail. And most of them are beginners, which I love. So I started the company, and then around that time, I also fell in love, got engaged, and got married. And all these good things were happening off trail. And now I had less time to go and hike. But I actually told Brew, that's my husband, Brew, yes, he likes craft beer. And no, it's not a trail name, I also have to clarify that. I told him on our very first date that if I could have one more adventure, I would just really want to hike the Appalachian Trail again. And even at that point where you're really trying to impress one another, he had no interest in doing it with me. But he was a public school teacher, and later on, much later on, he actually came up with the idea. He said, well, you want to do the trail. I have the summers off. Maybe I can support you or help you along the way. So that meant instead of carrying, 4 days worth of food, almost every day I could see my husband at a road crossing, and I could get more food, more supplies, fresh socks, and keep going. And I could carry much less because of that. And so when he offered to do that, I also at that point thought, well, man, I've always heard about these records on the Appalachian Trail, but every single one I know of has been set by a man. And the truth is, at that time, there was not a women's record, but I thought there should be. And I thought, well, man, if I have help and I really like pushing my limits, and if I don't get hurt, then maybe I can establish a women's record. So I went out to the Appalachian Trail again for the second time in 2008, and this time with Bruce's help. I finished the trail in 57 days. I averaged 38 miles a day, and we established a women's record. And it was the most unsatisfying finish to any trail that I've ever hiked. But the question is, why? Why do you think I got to the end and felt disappointed? Because what was it? I knew I could do it better. That is the right answer, but often, and most of the time, what people also say is, well, you went too fast and you missed out on some of the experience. And I want to acknowledge that they are right. Because you will miss out on things doing the trail in 57 days that you get when you do it at 5 months. The biggest thing I missed out on is the community and having the flexibility and serendipity to meet someone and stay with them for a few hours or a few days. I missed that. On the other hand, you will get or you will gain things doing the trail in 57 days that you cannot experience doing it in 5 months. They are very different animals. And one of the things I love the most about doing the trail in 57 days, and also one of the things I struggled the most with, was having support. This was the first time I started and finished with another person. And no, my husband and I were not walking every step together. He day hiked a little with me. I actually, now looking back, think his ambition in volunteering to support my hike was actually to try to visit every craft brewery within like 30 miles of the trail. But it was really hard. It was really hard to work as a team and to communicate. And we had only been married a little while. And, you know, we both say we worked a lot on communication that summer. And then we basically vowed not to go any deeper into it. But it brought us closer together. And I wouldn't trade it for the world. But the reason, you know, the real reason I was frustrated, and you were right when I got to the end, is because I knew by that point that I had limited myself from the beginning. Because when I started, there were two categories. There was a men's record and there was a women's record. And I thought I would be lucky to be within a week or two of the men's mark. And I hiked accordingly. But then I got out there, and you know, one of the surprises that summer, I thought I would have to hike a lot faster, or I would have to run to try to set this record. And I learned pretty quickly that I didn't really have to go a lot faster, I just needed to go a lot longer each day. And that actually allowed me to recover faster and made me feel better along the way. So I wasn't really running, I was just waking up early and then hiking late into the evening. And in that time, I realized that just by hiking without running, I could get 40, 45, even 50 miles a day and feel okay the next morning. And also on the trail, you just have all this time. So I had all this time to think, and I thought back to previous hikes and the friends I had made on trails, and I thought about the guys, and no offense to the men in here, but guys at the end of long trails look horrible. Horrible. They are emaciated. It is striking how much weight they have lost. And then on top of that, they're scruffy, and half of them are hunched over, and I haven't figured that out. But the women at the end of long trails, they don't look that way. I mean, ladies, usually we hate this, but we hold on to our weight better, right? Better. And when you're going over 2,000 miles, I don't know any other time, but when you're going over 2,000 miles, that's a good thing. We also have lower daily caloric and hydration needs, and when you're carrying all your supplies, that can be helpful. And then we've evolved to carry the weight of pregnancy and give birth. And we are champs at carrying packs. We are. Our bodies are built for it. Our hips are great for wearing the weight of packs, and I read this whole tedious academic paper about how women's feet even flatten out better under the added pressure of 30 pounds than a man's. Plus, then you think, you know, our pain threshold's got to be pretty darn high too, right? Right? So I had 57 days to think about this. And I also know off trail, I get really frustrated when I feel limited because of my gender or background or something I can't control. And then I realized I had done it to myself on the trail. And after finishing the trail in 57 days, I thought that maybe I had what it would take to set the overall record. But the next few years, I worked hard, and I did shorter trails in the summer with my husband at a traditional pace. And then it was at the point when we started talking about maybe trying to have a family. That is what sent me back to the Appalachian Trail. Honestly, it did, because when I started thinking about being a mom, and I had always hoped I could be a mom, wanted to be a mom, but it just hit me pretty hard that before giving not just my time, but my body over to motherhood, I really wanted to see what my body was capable of apart from that. And so I asked Brew if he would help me one more time, and he agreed. Well, honestly, at first he said, if you're asking, do I want to help you, then the answer is no. But he said, if this is really that important to you, then I'm going to be behind you 100%. And it was important. And so in 2011, we went back to the Appalachian Trail, and this time my goal was to set the overall record. And we started in Maine. Why do you think we wanted to start there? That was a factor. It's a good answer. What? Brew's out of school. That was also a factor. You guys are really good with your guesses. But no one's quite gotten the main factor. Why would you think, having hiked the trail? What's the hardest part of the trail? Yeah. Maine and New Hampshire, also downhill. I heard you wherever you are. Thank you for laughing. Half the time they're not kidding when they say that. We got to it. We got to it up here. Maine and New Hampshire are the toughest two states on the trail. Okay, they have the steepest climbs. They have a lot of scrambling where you have to use your hands, pull yourself up. They have the longest stretches above tree line where you're exposed. So I wanted to get through that in the beginning and not have it looming over me the entire way. But it makes it an extra tough start. And I was going down this granite mountain on day 4, this steep descent, and I remember I started to feel this sharp pain in my lower right leg. So I compensated and I kept going, and then I started to feel the exact same pain in my lower left leg. And by the end of the day, I had full-blown shin splints, which out of all the injuries and illnesses I've had on and off trail, shin splints have been the worst. Going uphill is excruciating. Going downhill is unbearable. So I was in so much pain that I would get to the top of a mountain. I'd reach the summit, and then I would turn and hike or scramble downhill backwards because it was more bearable. And this is literally how I hiked into New Hampshire, walking backwards. And I was like, bye-bye, Maine, peace, ready to get to a new state. But in New Hampshire, this is where you have the longest stretch above tree line, so I'm just praying for good weather. And I got there and I had 36 hours of torrential rain, followed by a sleet storm the last week of June. And going through the sleet storm, I became moderately hypothermic. And the only reason I was able to keep going is because my husband, who always waited for me at the road crossings, he assumed there had been bad weather, so he packed up our gear and hiked in as far as he could. And he set up our tent, so I came off this icy ridge, and then I got in the tent and curled up into 2 sleeping bags. And for 30 minutes, all I could do was just shiver. And then finally, I started to relax just a little bit. So I ate a ton of food, and then I put on dry clothes, some of which were my husband's, and I kept going. But I had these really strange side effects from the hypothermia, and my body was swollen. Well, I was incredibly lethargic, and then I was bloated and retaining water, and even when it warmed up, I couldn't sweat. And it stayed like that for a day and a half, and I got into Vermont, and then because of that, or on top of that, I got really sick. So now I'm behind record pace, I'm depleted, dehydrated, just running into the bushes and struggling to go a mile per hour. So when I finally stumble out to the next road crossing and tears are just streaming down my face, and Brew is there waiting for me like always, so I turn to him and I say, "We are done. We are done with the trail and done with the record, and all I want to do is go home." And Brew looked up at me and he said, "If you really want to quit, if that's truly what you want," he said, "that's fine." But then he added, "You just can't quit right now." He said, "Right now you feel too bad to make a good decision, so you got to eat and drink and take medicine and then keep going until tomorrow night. And tomorrow night, if you still want to quit, I'll take you home." So he said all that, and then he drove off. And it's very hard to quit without a ride. So I kept going, and for the longest time, nothing changed. But eventually the medicine kicked in, and I could hold in a little food and a little water. And at that point, still, no part of me thought I could set the record. I fully 100% thought it was long gone. I did not have a shot at it. But now I started to feel like if I really wanted to, I might be able to keep going. So then I had a decision to make. Was I out there for the record? And when I started, and when I trained for 10 months leading up to the start, it really felt like I was going after the record. Then when it was no longer an option, what I realized is I was out there for something else. It was not the most important thing for me to be the best. What was very important for me was to find my best. And I also wanted to be able to move on after that summer and embrace a different adventure and a different pace and not look back with any unanswered questions or regrets. And I felt like if I could keep going, then I hadn't found my best. So I decided to continue. And I let go of this idea of the record. And when I did that, I realized how oppressive the record had been. I mean, up until that moment, I had just been demoralized, and mostly by numbers, by miles per hour and miles per day. And I was always thinking about, where the current record holder was, and that was ridiculous because he had set the record years before, so he's not on trail, he's at home drinking beer. But in my mind, I saw that guy like every day. And then I let go of the numbers and I let go of the comparisons, and instead of waking up each morning with just these daunting expectations, I started to wake up each morning and ask myself, what can I do today? What can I do? How far can I go? And when that psychological shift occurred, what do you think happened to my miles? They went up. What do you think happened to my enjoyment? It went up. Yep. That all went down on day 12, and that's the moment, that's the day where we say it became our hike, our adventure. Up until then, I was running someone else's race. And Brew and I had a long talk about how, I felt so demoralized by these numbers, and we agreed we wouldn't talk about them anymore. He still kept track of them in the car, but when we were at the road crossings, the one thing he would say every day is just do your best and leave it all out on the trail. So that became my focus and my mantra for the next 36 days. And when we finally got to the end, there was a flood of emotions. It was so surprising. It's almost honestly like the end of this book tour. We have been on the road, as I've mentioned a couple times, for 4 months without a babysitter. And I just kept thinking, it's going to be great when we get home. And now we're less than 2 weeks from the end, and I'm a little sad. And it was the same when I got to the end of the Appalachian Trail. I was so happy. I was so tired. I was so sad it was over. But it is one of the few times in my life I could stand there and say, I think for the past season, I gave my best. I really did give my best. And I have my answer. And I think the most important realization of the summit was knowing that I could have never completed the Appalachian Trail in 46 days alone. And then having the person who means the most to me standing there beside me. That was the gift, and that was the reward. And do you want to guess one of the best days of being a record holder? The day it gets broken. Yeah, it's bittersweet. There is some sting to it. But I remember hearing that someone else broke the record, and I will say, you know, records are made to be broken, so that's cool. And the guy who broke our record is a really nice fellow. The one thing I take issue with is he only broke it by 3 hours. Which I'm like, if you're gonna break a record, break it good, you know? Break it by 12 hours. Don't make me rethink every pit stop along the way. But I also, you know, I remember feeling this warmth and this fullness and realizing that nothing had changed. Nothing had changed. And all the lessons of that summer and the memories and the way I grew with my husband, it was all still there. And I'll also, you know, I will tell you, we set that record 7 years ago, and it has been surpassed, but our time is still the fastest female time on the trail and within 24 hours of the overall record. And I haven't done a 40-mile day since then. Not one. I have been working hard, and I have 2 young children, and I try to use my body. I'll try to hike or run a couple times a week, but now, you know, when I run, I go 3 to 5 miles, and if I get to the end and I have not peed on myself, it is a huge success. It is a huge success. But that is 7 years and 2 kids. And here is the catch. I use the lessons of hiking 47 miles a day all the time. All the time. It's just a different application. Now it's parenting and sleepless nights. And it's work deadlines that I don't think I can meet. And it's trying to offer support to a friend who's going through a divorce or going through chemo. And I still use the lessons of hiking 47 miles a day all the time. And that was the inspiration, way more than setting the record. It was the life application that made me want to write the new book. And so with the new book, The Pursuit of Endurance, what it is it's way more than just my story. I spent 2.5 years doing interviews. And I interviewed men and women who have accomplished amazing things and set records on trails. And you know, I wanted to hear about their adventures because they're fun to hear about. But way more than that, I wanted to ask them what they learned, how it helps them in their life off trail, and how it could help someone else. So that's what I spent time asking them about. And I also, I wanted to know more about endurance, so I interviewed an expert physiologist. And that was really interesting because he's the guy who asked all the questions about body type and gender and mechanics, whether it's better to run or hike when you're going 2,000 miles. I asked him about diet. And there are definitely finer points to all those topics, but we got to the end of this really long interview, and what I was struck by is that the differences mattered far less than I thought they might. Because at the end of the day, endurance is so mental. So mental. So I interviewed a sports psychologist, but to me what's so captivating about this book is all these people who are willing to share what allowed them to get through their lowest moments on and off trail. And so there's 6 folks in here who shared their stories, and I don't have time to tell you about all of them tonight, but this is the fun part of the evening. This is the Choose Your Own Adventure. So I'll give you a brief overview of the 6 folks, and then you get to choose 1 or 2 to hear a little bit more about. So the people in here include Warren Doyle, who he has hiked the Appalachian Trail more than anyone else. He's working on his 18th completion. He set a record, one of the first records back in the 1970s. He also is the only person I know to hike the John Muir Trail, or any trail, eating only Little Debbie brownies the entire way, and he lost weight. Another individual in here is David Horton, who is a godfather of ultra running. He set records on the Appalachian Trail and Pacific Crest Trail. He is the only person I know who has had a septuple bypass surgery, and that did not stop him from running. There's a fellow in here named Andrew Thompson. It was one of the more interesting interviews I had because he was the guy. He was the guy I saw on the trail, right? He had the record that I broke. And at one point I was sitting in this living room interviewing him, and he brought out a gun. So you might have to read more about that one. But Andrew also is one of the handful of finishers of the 100-mile Barkley Ultramarathon, which is considered to be the toughest ultra race in the world. Then the guy I was most excited to talk to is a fellow named Scott Williamson. He has over 55,000 miles, and most of them have been completed with a bullet lodged in his spine. Then there's my trail sister in here, the other female who has come out and set records on not just the Appalachian Trail, but also the Pacific Crest Trail. Her name is Heather Anderson. And then finally, there's that fellow who broke my record by 3 hours, and his name's Scott Jurek. So out of those folks, who do you want to hear a little bit more about? Scott Williamson? Okay, we'll start with Scott and see if we have any more time. So Scott Williamson, my hands are getting full. Can you guys still hear me with this or no? It says the battery. Hello? Okay. Sorry, the battery light came on, so I'll stand back here. So Scott Williamson, to me, was really essential to this project because he embodies the essence of trail records, or fastest known times. And I was really concerned I wouldn't be able to interview him because he, until this book, had not done an official interview since 2003. And the only reason I got to talk to him is because when I hiked the Pacific Crest Trail, which was back in 2006, I actually met Scott briefly. And I was in the Cascades of Washington State, and I had just come out of this horrible storm, and he was about to go up into it. So we were headed in opposite directions. And I knew I was getting close to a road where I could go into town and resupply, and based off the storm, Scott would probably be delayed or thrown off his schedule. So I took off my pack and dug inside and gave him basically all the food I had left, which was just a few measly energy bars. But 12 years later, those measly energy bars got me an interview with Scott Williamson, which proves 2 things. It pays to be nice, and hikers never forget food, ever. When I reached out, I didn't even use my name. I said, I was that woman in that storm at that pass, and I give you the energy bars. And he said, okay. So I flew out west to meet with Scott Williamson in Truckee, California. And you know, it's so interesting because everyone in this book has a very, very different background. And Scott's was probably the hardest. He grew up in an abusive home. He grew up in a violent neighborhood. And he never graduated from high school. He said the high school he went to was filled with gangs, and he didn't feel safe there. So instead, he would skip school and go to the public library. He would read books, and he also said sometimes he would go to the nature preserve and climb up trees. But it was at the library he read a book about the Pacific Crest Trail, and he decided he was going to do it. So at the age of 18, instead of graduating from high school like most folks, he set out on his own with a pack on his back from the Mexican-US border, and he hiked basically 2,700 miles on his own up to Canada. The next year, he was 19, and he went out to do the Continental Divide Trail, which is even longer. It's 3,000 miles between Mexico and Canada through the Rockies. And this is 25 years ago when that trail was very, very in its beginning phases. It was very poorly marked. Hardly anyone else hiked it. The year Scott hiked it, there was only one other completer, and they were going in opposite directions. But he finished, and then when he was 20, the following year, he went to hike the Appalachian Trail. But he didn't start in Georgia or Maine. He started at the southern tip of Florida. And he hiked through Florida. There's actually, this surprises most folks, there's a 1,400-mile trail in Florida. And yes, it's flat, but it's also one of the scariest paths I've ever been on. I mean, it has alligators and water moccasins and cedar swamps. It's kind of crazy. But that's where he started. He hiked there. He walked roads in Georgia to meet the Appalachian Trail. He followed the AT all the way to Katahdin, the last mountain in Maine. And then he kept going up towards the Canadian border. And 20 miles short of the Canadian border, he was stopped. Because at that point, he was on private land, and it was a commercial logging operation who actually said, I'm sorry, you can't keep hiking, so you need to stop. And Scott Williamson said, okay, and he went home. And that drives me crazy. I'm like, Scott, you were 20 miles short of the border. Like, you got to go ninja. You got to make it to Canada, man. And he looked at me and he said, you know, my whole goal was to walk until I couldn't go any farther. So what's the difference if I get stopped or if I make it to an invisible boundary? So he went home and he started saving up for his next big adventure. And he was working at a liquor store in his hometown. And he took a shift that he wasn't supposed to have, and it was 5 minutes before closing. And then for no reason, a man he had never seen before walked inside the store, came up to the cash register. It was not a robbery. He didn't take any money, but he pulled out a gun and he shot Scott in the face. And so Scott was rushed to the hospital, and the doctors said the bullet, which was in his spine, it was such a precarious position that it couldn't be removed. And if it had been a quarter of an inch higher or lower, he would have been paralyzed for life. So they wired his jaw back together, and 3 months later, Scott Williamson started the Pacific Crest Trail again. And it's interesting because he paused at that point in our interview and he said, you know, one of the reasons I hate it when other people write about me is because they all want to make it sound like I'm running away. Like I'm running away from my past or violence or the gunshot wound. And he said, that's not true. But then he followed it up and he said, but I'm going to be damned if I've let what's happened to me in the past keep me from doing what I love. And I love to be outdoors, and I love to hike. And the thing he worked on longer than anything else is he wanted to be the first person to what we would call yo-yo the Pacific Crest Trail. Any ideas what a yo-yo is? Yeah, good job. Good guessing again. To do it twice in a calendar year. And that's very difficult on the Pacific Crest Trail because you have snow in the Sierras, snow in the Cascades, and now also lots of wildfires that can prevent you from hiking the trail. And so Scott Williamson tried to yo-yo it, and he failed. And over the course of a decade, he tried 6 times. 6 times. He failed, and 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 he failed. And then he did it. And then he did it again. And then he set 3 consecutive trail records on the Pacific Crest Trail, just lowering his own time every year. And this is why, in my mind, he was so important to this project, is because, you know, one thing this book addresses is, well, what are trail records? And what is this sport of fastest known times? And is it a sport? And if so, what are the rules and who are the judges? And I have opinions about all that, but at the end of the day, Scott Williamson is the essence of trail records and fastest known times, because he still is on the trail every summer and he is still pushing his limits, and there is a really good chance that he is still setting records, and you and I will never know about it. Because he has said that if he ever sets another record, he's never going to tell anyone about it. He said, "I didn't go into the woods to seek the limelight. Even if I set a record," he says, "someone will come along and break it eventually. So if I'm not doing this for personal satisfaction, then what's the point?" And again, there's a lot of debate about the significance or the rules of trail records. But like most long endeavors, if you're not doing it for intrinsic reasons, if you're not doing it for personal satisfaction, then what's the point? And Scott Williamson shows us that better than anyone else I know and anyone else in the book. So because he's my favorite, I tend to talk a little longer about him. So I don't think we have a time for another character sketch tonight, but I am going to close this out by reading a paragraph from the last chapter of the book that to me gets to the heart of the book, and then we'll open it up for a few more questions. And my husband is not here to defend himself tonight because he is putting our 2 young children to bed at the hotel. This section makes him sound a little snarky, but just know that he's really wonderful most of the time. When Brew and I are in the car and we pass a runner or walker on the sidewalk, it is natural for my husband to make comments about how fast or slow they're going and what their stride looks like. But my rule of thumb is that you can never judge someone else's pace or form because you don't know how far they've come or what they're still planning to do. We all have our long trails, and most of them do not include much hiking or running. Outside the forest, our paths take the form of higher education, climbing out of debt, navigating a career, staying married, undergoing divorce, surviving tragedy, and coping with illness. And it helps us all to not come to quick conclusions about other people's paths, and instead approach each individual with encouragement and compassion. Because we might be on different trails, but we are all mid-journey. Thank you. So can I do a few more questions? Okay, so I'm going to stand back here and do a few more questions. Just make sure if you have a question, you try to ask as loudly as possible so that I can hear you, and then I'll try to repeat it as well. So what do you want to know? Yeah.
What agency keeps the rules of hiking records or keeps track, and how do you document and verify that these are truthful? You touched on it a little.
I did, and it's one of the things I love most about the sport, and it's one of also the most debatable issues. But there is no agency, there is no group, there is no board. They're recognized by the community, and they're based on the honor system. And I love that, but it's changing. It's changing because it can change now with GPS. And with the internet, there's more ways to verify a claim. You can give more updates. You can provide GPS tracks the entire way. And it's changing. More and more people are involved in the sport, and there have been more false claims. And that's one reason that more verification and more rules have been set. But I kind of fight against that a little bit, because with the formalization of the sport comes more sponsorship. 2 of the last 3, Yeah, two of the last three guys who have set the record on the Appalachian Trail, they have had big sponsorships behind them. And I think, the more formal the sport gets, the more commercialized it gets. And I don't think you can ever buy a trail record. I don't think you can buy endurance. But I also love the messiness of it. And I don't think you can ever really compare two records equally because everyone has different weather. People go in different directions. People have different advantages. When my husband and we set the record, it was only 7 years ago, but we did not have smartphones. We did not have a GPS to find road crossings. We used handheld maps and gazetteers. There's two main types of records, ones where you have help, like I received help, and then ones where you resupply yourself along the way. And on the self-supported records without help, there's been a huge advantage gained because of technology. Whereas 15 years ago, people had to pre-plan all of their resupplies. Now you can Amazon Prime your next shipment in 2 days, And emotionally, like at your lowest moment, if you have cell service, you can call someone and they can tell you what Brew told me at the road crossing. So I think technology has changed it a lot. And, that, again, is why Scott Williamson, at the end of the day, for me, is so important to this, if you want to call it sport. But I think it's more of an endeavor. It's because I think you need to go after it for personal reasons. And at the end, you know what you've accomplished, and that needs to be good enough. So it's a long kind of rambling answer, but it's still a pretty messy sport in general.
Do you think that because that you were a little bit loopy from being up so high in the mountains?
I don't think it was altitude. The tallest mountains on the East Coast are just over 6,000 feet, so not as high as the mountains in the Rockies or out on the Pacific Crest Trail, but I was definitely a little loopy due to sleep deprivation. That was the biggest thing. And I actually, doing these interviews, I realized I had it pretty good. A lot of these other athletes talked about very, very vivid hallucinations and bad dreams that they would have, and then lingering dreams when they finished. They said their minds, as soon as they fell asleep, they would be on the trail. And it would stay like that for weeks or months. And the only thing I had like that is actually pretty funny. I remember one night on the trail, I was camping in a tent with my husband, and I woke up sort of on my knees against the tent, and Brew was shaking me, trying to wake me up. And when I came to, I realized that I had basically been trying to sleep hike. So in my mind, I thought I was hiking, and I wanted to keep going and wanted to get to the trail. And so Brew had to shake me awake and basically say, it's not time to hike now. It's time to go to sleep. And then that happened in Pennsylvania, and for the whole rest of the trip, like whenever, if I had to wake up in the middle of the night to go pee or whatever, there was like an interrogation of like, are you awake? Are you trying to hike? Where are you going? What do you need to do? So at that point, Brew felt like he couldn't even sleep as my support person. But yeah, there were definitely times where, in a strange way, even though you're trying to eat 7,000 or 8,000 calories a day, it almost felt like a fast. It almost felt like you were in an altered physical state because of how far you were going each day. That's a good question. What else do you guys want to know? One or two more? Yeah.
I was recently on the Appalachian Trail near Harper's Ferry, and many of the hikers now are carrying tasers.
I haven't seen a taser on the trail. I'm not denying it, but I haven't seen a taser on the trail. I know that, a question I get asked pretty frequently is, do I carry any form of protection? And usually people are referring to a gun or a handgun. And I don't on the trail. Again, you can compare the statistics, and I do feel relatively safe on the trail. I also think when it comes to that thing, or that form of protection, in a way a taser might make more sense, because in order for it to be effective, you have to have it accessible at all times. And that's very hard to do with hiking poles and water bottles and a pack on. The only thing I've ever carried as far as protection has been grizzly spray in grizzly country. And actually, I even have a funny story about that. I was hiking just north of Yellowstone, and there was a mama grizzly and cubs, and I saw her on the trail, but I kept going because the trail was going to get me farther away from her, and in the meantime, I reached down to the hip belt where my bear spray was. And I picked it up in my hand, and I kept my eye focused on the bear, and then kept going until I got a safe distance away. And the bear spray is the cylinder, basically, canister, and so is my water filter. And when I looked down, I realized I had been carrying my water filter for the past 100 yards, and so I don't think it would have been very effective against the grizzly. But that's a really interesting observation. I'll have to ask more people about that and see if they've seen it. Yeah?
I'm curious about what you've been able to get your pack weight down to.
So I, surprisingly, even though I did not have great gear, I wasn't one of the folks you hear about starting the trail with 50, 60 pounds. On my first hike, I probably carried about 35 pounds, and that's what we call a base weight, so your gear without food and water. And now, on most trails, spring, summer, or fall, it always, it always depends on the conditions. If you have to carry a bear canister or an ice axe or crampons, those things are going to add up very quickly. But assuming I'm not carrying those things in my pack, usually it's around a 15-pound base weight. And I firmly feel like I have everything I need with me to be safe and, for the most part, comfortable on the trail. Yeah. Any other questions before we wrap up? Yeah. That's a good question. On the Appalachian Trail, no, I don't. It's, after having kids, I could never turn my time and attention to it the way it demands, I think. But it's interesting because I feel like for the past 6 years, I haven't had any desire really or physical ambition to do an ultramarathon or to set a record on a shorter trail or to test my limits or to push myself at all. I mean, kids, that is that is the endurance. But it is just recently, and my daughter will start kindergarten this month, and my son will enter, he'll be 2 in September, so he'll enter a little half-day preschool. And it doesn't feel like much, but I do have more freedom now, or I will, than I have had in 6 years. I mean, for 6 years, I was pregnant and then nursing, and then I had a knee surgery, and then I was in PT, and then I was pregnant and nursing. And I've started to notice a little bit of curiosity about maybe what I could do. And I think it's interesting because, when I set the record, I was really proud of an accomplishment that made a statement that says women are equal. But now I kind of want to do something that says personally, and maybe in a larger sense, that moms are equal and valuable too. So don't put any pressure on me. Don't do that. Don't do that yet. I haven't made any decisions. I just feel like as a mom, you sort of have to reclaim something, and I'm interested to see what that will be for me. That's all I'll say. So on that note, glad my husband wasn't here for that. We will have a book signing up on stage, and I have the new book, The Pursuit of Endurance. They're pretty and have covers on them in the back. This is the one my son drew on, but we can take card, cash, or check, and they're $27 even. And then I also have a few of my earlier books back here. You're welcome to come to the book table if you do not want a book. You're welcome to ask questions, visit, take a photo. We have some free stickers, a few little giveaways. If you sign up for the email newsletter, you'll be entered to win either a free pair of shoes and socks at the end of the month. And also, I mentioned the water filter. We have a giveaway where there's a new website. It's a gear list website. So if you write in what gear you take hiking and then share it, you'll win a free water filter. They have 100 that they're just giving away. So if you're interested in either of those, feel free to come up and do that. And then, if you want to follow our journeys, feel free to come see us and hike with us in North Carolina or find us on social media. But thank you guys so much, and thank you to the library. We really appreciate it.